All through the night, the sky roared with bombardment. Institutions that once symbolized hope, built after the Oslo Accords, now lay shattered. By morning, weary officials with polished titles tried to frame the devastation as something noble, but on the ground, people were stranded, hungry, and surviving on soaked chickpeas, clinging to life while promises crumbled around them. This is just one of dozens of stories lived by West Bank residents every day, every hour.
ممنوع منع بات العذر ما بيجي على كل شيء بني انا هذا يعتبر بناض انا زي ما شايف زين كلوح وشي سنلون وملحقين عليها شي اللي بيخلينا نبني شو بدنا نعمل لكم مش يسووا مستوطنات بيسووا اوتيلات ويتوسعوا ويسووا منتزهات ويسووا شوارع احنا ممنوعين.
The entire world agrees that the West Bank is land for an independent Palestinian state. And indeed, it has a government, a president, villages, and a people. A picture that might seem normal from afar, but if we delve a bit deeper, we see a plot unfolding. Today, the West Bank is home to over 500,000 Israeli settlers living there illegally, backed by power, apartheid, oppression, and arms. The land is being carved apart by checkpoints, walls, and barriers until this region has become quite literally torn to pieces. In this video, we'll dive deeper into this topic. We will explore Israel's plans to tear apart this region, how it was separated from Gaza, and the violent conflict between Fatah and Hamas, a struggle that shaped the destiny of Palestine. It's a story that is vast, complex, and deeply consequential. The story begins in the 1920s when what we now call the occupied Palestinian territories was known as historic Palestine and was under British colonial rule. During this period, hundreds and even thousands of Jewish immigrants began arriving, especially during World War II, when the genocide of Jews in Europe by Hitler and the Nazi regime took place. This horrific event drew global sympathy for the Jewish people and pushed the major powers of the time to support the idea of creating a national homeland for them, an idea first formally declared by the Zionist Congress in 1897, with the chosen location being Palestine itself. And that's exactly what happened. In 1948, Britain officially announced its withdrawal from mandatory Palestine and proposed replacing its rule with two states, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews. But there was a major problem with this partition. Much of the land granted to the Jews was already home to hundreds of thousands of Arabs. Meanwhile, the Jewish population had grown dramatically, and armed Jewish militias began to emerge. To understand why these militias were created, we need to look back to the Arab Revolt of 1936-39, a massive uprising by Palestinian Arabs against British rule and Jewish immigration. The revolt pushed Britain to issue the 1939 White Paper, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine. This decision enraged many Jews, especially as Nazi persecution intensified in Europe. They believed Britain had abandoned them in their time of greatest need. So, underground militias formed not only to defend Jewish settlements from Arab attacks, but also to challenge British restrictions and ensure the survival of a future Jewish homeland. These underground militias were not small groups. They became highly organized forces with significant financial and political backing. The largest was the Haganah, considered the main military organization of the Jewish community in Palestine. It received private funding from wealthy donors, support from American Jewry, and surprisingly, even indirect backing from the Soviet Union, which saw the emerging state of Israel as a potential ally against British colonial influence. Through a series of military operations and expulsions, these forces drove more than 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands, an event remembered as the Nakba, or catastrophe. In May 1948, amid this turmoil, the leaders of the Jewish community declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This declaration triggered immediate outrage across the Arab world, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948. The war lasted an entire year and ended with Israel seizing far more land than Britain had originally allocated, around 74% of all historic Palestine. To put this into perspective, when Britain decided to withdraw and implement the UN Partition Plan of 1947, Resolution 181, Israel was granted 54% of the land, while the Palestinians were left with just 44%, despite having previously inhabited around 80%. Most of the world recognized this newly captured territory as the official state of Israel. Meanwhile, the remaining parts of Palestine came under Arab administration, Gaza under Egyptian control, and the West Bank under Jordanian rule. Moving to 1967, on June 5th at 8 a.m., Israel launched a preemptive strike, destroying most of the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces within hours. This allowed Israeli ground forces to advance swiftly into the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and Gaza, seizing vast areas of land in just a matter of days. The Israeli public never imagined they would capture such a vast amount of land and in just 6 days. To many Jews, this victory felt like a divine sign, a confirmation that they truly deserved this land. From this moment onward, the expansion began. Jews from all over the world began migrating to Israel, causing their population to multiply rapidly. This surge sparked a wave of settlement construction across every piece of land seized in the war: Golan, Sinai, Gaza, and most prominently, the West Bank. But why the West Bank? Well, because for many Jews, settling there carried profound religious meaning. They believed they had returned to their ancestral homeland, what they called Judea or Samaria. This led to a terrifying spread of Jewish settlers across the West Bank. These settlers was often either poor Jews who couldn't afford life in the large modern cities that resembled those in Europe and the US, or deeply religious Jews. Both groups were known for their extremism and their willingness to kill over a piece of land. As accepted, clashes between settlers and Palestinians erupted, but these confrontations remained relatively limited until 1979. That year, Egypt's President Anwar el-Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, brokered by the United States. On one hand, the deal forced Israel into a gradual withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, territory it had captured during the Six-Day War. Yet many saw it as a trade-off. Egypt regained Sinai, but in return, the Palestinian cause was effectively sidelined. For Palestinians, it marked a tragic moment. Egypt, the most powerful Arab state, had stepped away from the battlefield, leaving them more isolated in the struggle. Following the agreement, Israel was forced to evacuate its settlers from Sinai. To ease the process, the government offered them generous compensation and promised to relocate them into new settlements, this time deep inside the occupied West Bank. For Palestinians, this was the ultimate betrayal. While Egypt celebrated the return of Sinai, settlement expansion on their own land only accelerated. In the early 1980s, the West Bank witnessed a massive influx of Israeli settlers. With them came a growing military presence, soldiers, checkpoints, and patrols. By the mid-1980s, life for Palestinians had become suffocating. Entire towns were surrounded. Travel required hours of waiting at military checkpoints, and daily humiliation became routine. It was no longer possible to live a normal life under such conditions. The pressure kept building, and Palestinians expressed their anger in successive waves of protests: 1974, 76, 80, and again in 1982. Each time, the demonstrations were crashed, but the anger never disappeared. Instead, it grew stronger, simmering beneath the surface. Finally, in December 1987, it all erupted. What had been scattered waves of resistance now exploded into a full-scale uprising, the First Intifada, confrontations between Palestinians and the Israeli army. During this uprising, young Palestinians armed themselves with nothing but stones and handmade firebombs. In response, the Israeli army unleashed overwhelming force, bullets, armored vehicles, and mass arrests. Hundreds of protesters were killed. These confrontations revealed the painful truth to the Palestinians that stones and improvised bombs could never stand against Israel's tanks and advanced weaponry. In the midst of the uprising, a group of Palestinians moved in secret to establish the Islamic Resistance Movement, better known as Hamas. Unlike the spontaneous protests of the Intifada, Hamas introduced a new form of resistance, more organized, more structured, and far deadlier than stones and handmade firebombs. Their operations struck at Israel in ways that could not be ignored, damaging its image on the world stage. Faced with growing unrest, international pressure, and the limits of military force, Israel eventually shifted its approach. For the first time, it decided to sit at the same table with the Palestinians, opening the door to dialogue and negotiations in the search for a political solution. With the Palestinians, another figure was moving behind the scenes: Yasser Arafat, the longtime leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. For decades, he had fought against Israel, yet by the early 1990s, he had come to believe that the only path forward was a peace agreement and the acceptance of a two-state solution, one for Israel and one for Palestine. Then came the shock. In 1993, Israel officially sat down with the PLO to sign what became known as the OSLO Accords. The deal required Palestinians to recognize the State of Israel, while Israel promised a gradual withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, paving the way for a future Palestinian state. But the accords came with heavy conditions. Israel demanded that Palestinian resistance abandon its weapons and dismantle its armed struggle. For many, these were impossible terms designed so Palestinians would reject them. Yet, to the surprise of the world, the PLO accepted, and Arafat signed the Oslo Agreement. This agreement was strange. Both sides signed it with deep hesitation. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin feared being branded a traitor by his own people, while Arafat signed under immense pressure, hoping to preserve what little remained of Palestine, especially as the world's attention was consumed by the Gulf War. Very quickly, Oslo began to unravel. In Palestine, Arafat's once legendary popularity collapsed. The man who had been hailed as the father of the nation was now seen by many as a leader who surrendered too much. Along with his declining image came the weakening of his movement Fatah. Into this vacuum stepped Hamas, rising rapidly as the fierce new challenger, winning over Palestinians who felt betrayed. On the Israeli side, the backlash was just as intense. Rabin faced massive street protests where thousands accused him of treason for shaking hands with terrorists. Leading these demonstrations was a rising figure, Benjamin Netanyahu, rooted in the hardline ideology of Jabotinsky. Netanyahu insisted that peace with Palestinians was impossible.
Do the Palestinians have a right to a separate state?
No, I don't think they do.
Jabotinsky himself had once declared, "Whoever thinks Palestinians will reach an agreement is a fool. They will never abandon their land." Netanyahu carried this worldview into his political career. His father had been a close associate of Jabotinsky, and Netanyahu devoted much of his life to blocking any possibility of a Palestinian state, believing that only force could decide the conflict. Israel's most beloved figures, a founding father of the state and a hero of the 1967 war, saw his legacy shattered in a matter of months, all because of a handshake with Arafat. His popularity plummeted, his reputation stained, and ultimately he paid with his life. While many Israelis despised him, there were still those who stood firmly by his side, believing that peace was the only path forward. And Rabin, confident in the loyalty of his people, often joined pro-peace rallies himself, never imagining that an Israeli hand would be the one to end his life. But on the night of November 4, 1995, during a massive peace rally in Tel Aviv, at the square of the King of Israel, the unthinkable happened. As the rally ended, a young Jewish extremist of Yemeni origin, Yigal Amir, slipped through the crowd and fired 3 bullets at Rabin, killing him instantly. The assassination sent shockwaves not only across Israel, but the entire world. And as the nation searched for answers, suspicion and blame quickly turned toward one man, the opposition leader who had fueled the hatred on the streets, Benjamin Netanyahu. With Rabin's assassination and Arafat's decline in popularity, one could say that the era of secular leadership on both sides came to an end. A new phase began. On the Palestinian side, the rise of Islamist movement like Hamas, and on the Israeli side, the dominance of the hard right under Benjamin Netanyahu. Just 1 year after Rabin's death, Netanyahu became Israel's prime minister with a clear mission to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state at any cost. One of his most effective tools was expanding settlements in the West Bank. The logic was simple. The more settlements Israel built, the harder it would be to establish a viable Palestinian state. By the early 2000s, settlers were taking over Palestinian land at a terrifying pace. With every new settlement came more soldiers, more checkpoints, and more restrictions on Palestinian life. Then Israel went further, constructing a massive 400-kilometer separation wall, slicing through the West Bank, cutting families apart, and forcing Palestinians to spend hours, even days, at checkpoints, sometimes never been allowed to cross at all.
نملك هان أنا وإخوتي لحالنا في هذا المحل 90 دلم نعتاش منهن. الآن أجى الكثير قطع بيننا وبين الأرض، معظم الأرض مزروعة بالزيتون، وإذا بدنا نروح من هين بيني وبين الكثير 60 متر. أنا في نفس القطعة، ولكن لما قطعوا بيني وبين الأرض صار بيني وبينها 60 متر، صرت أمشي تقريبا 20 ل 22 كيلو متر روحة وكد هنزيني.
Meanwhile, in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, handing it over to the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah. But this control was short-lived. In the 2006 elections, Hamas won a shocking victory. Fatah refused to accept the results, and soon violent clashes erupted between the two movements. What began as a political rivalry turned into a bloody civil war in Gaza. By 2007, Hamas had seized full control of the Strip, while Fatah retained authority over parts of the West Bank. This internal division was a gift to Israel, and Netanyahu exploited it masterfully. He treated Gaza and the West Bank as if they were two separate entities. Gaza was portrayed as an enemy state ruled by Hamas, justifying repeated wars and blockades, while in the West Bank, Israel quietly accelerated settlement expansion and land confiscation. What is most alarming is how these settlements evolved under Netanyahu, no longer just outposts or small clusters of houses. They became fully developed cities with schools, parks, universities, and modern infrastructure. Today, around 500,000 settlers live in the West Bank, and Israel controls nearly 60% of its territory. So while the world's eyes remain fixed on Gaza, the silent war is being waged in the West Bank through settlements, walls, and a slow-motion process of dispossession.